The salvage beacon stopped working 3 days ago, but nobody bothered to fix it. Dead ships floating in space rarely had anything valuable left inside, and this particular wreck had been drifting near the edge of human territory for over a month. Most crews would have ignored it completely, but the research vessel Harmony needed spare parts and scrap metal was better than nothing. Tim pressed his nose against the viewing port, watching the strange ship grow larger as they approached. It looked nothing like human vessels, with smooth curves instead of sharp angles, and a surface that seemed to shimmer in the starlight. His father had told him to stay in his quarters during the salvage operation, but 8-year-old boys were not known for following orders, especially when something this interesting was happening right outside their window. The ship's hull had several large holes torn through it, probably from asteroid impacts during its long drift through space. Inside those dark openings, Tim could see a faint blue glow that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. He had never seen anything like it before, and the mystery made his skin tingle with excitement. Reynolds finished checking his suit seals and looked at his small salvage team. 3 people seemed like enough for a quick sweep of the alien vessel. They had detected no life signs, no active power systems, and no obvious dangers. It should be a simple job of cataloging anything useful before moving on to their next research station. Remember, we are scientists first and salvagers second, Reynolds reminded his team as they cycled through the airlock. Document everything before you touch it. Unknown technology could be dangerous or valuable, sometimes both. Hayes nodded and adjusted her scanner settings. As the ship's xenobiologist, she was more excited about this discovery than anyone else. Alien vessels were incredibly rare, and most of them had been picked clean by previous salvage crews. This one seemed intact enough to still hold secrets. The boarding party crossed the short distance between ships using their suit thrusters. The largest hull breach provided easy access to what appeared to be a cargo bay. Emergency lights flickered weakly along the walls, suggesting that some backup power still remained in the alien ship's systems. Tim watched from his hiding spot near the shuttle bay as the adults disappeared into the mysterious vessel. He waited exactly 5 minutes before putting on his child-sized emergency suit and following them. His father would be angry later, but Tim had learned that asking for forgiveness was usually easier than asking for permission. The inside of the alien ship felt different from human vessels. The corridors were wider, with gentle curves instead of straight lines. The walls had an organic quality that reminded Tim of being inside a giant seashell. Strange symbols glowed faintly along what might have been control panels, pulsing in rhythm with the blue light he had seen from outside. Tim followed the salvage team's helmet lights deeper into the ship. Their voices crackled over the radio as they moved through what appeared to be living quarters, designed for creatures much larger than humans. Everything seemed abandoned but preserved, as if the crew had simply vanished rather than dying in some catastrophe. "Reynolds, you need to see this," Hayes called from somewhere ahead. Her voice carried a note of wonder that made Tim hurry to catch up. He found the team standing in a circular chamber filled with dozens of crystalline structures, each one about the size of a human torso. The crystal formations were arranged in neat rows, supported by metal frameworks that kept them suspended above the floor. Most of them were cracked open, their contents long gone, but a few remained intact. The blue glow was coming from these undamaged crystals, pulsing steadily like sleeping hearts. "They look like eggs," Tim whispered, forgetting that his radio was active. "Tim." Reynolds spun around, his face angry behind his helmet visor. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay on the ship." "I wanted to see," Tim replied simply. "Are they really eggs?" Hayes was already scanning one of the intact crystals with her instruments. The boy might be right. These readings suggest organic material inside, suspended in some kind of stasis field. The broken ones show signs of successful hatching, but these remaining few seem to be waiting for something. Reynolds sighed and checked his air supply. "We will discuss your disobedience later, young man. For now, stay close and do not touch anything." But Tim was already moving toward the nearest intact crystal. Something about it called to him, a feeling he could not explain or resist. The blue glow seemed to pulse faster as he approached, and he could almost hear a faint humming sound that made his teeth vibrate. "Tim, stop!" Reynolds reached for his son, but it was too late. Tim pressed his gloved hands against the warm surface of the crystal. The humming became a song, beautiful, and, sad and full of longing. The blue light flared brightly, and hairline cracks spread across the crystal's surface like a spider web. The egg shattered. A small creature tumbled out in a shower of glowing fluid. It was no bigger than a house cat, with 4 legs, 2 delicate wings and scales that shifted color from deep blue to silver as it looked around. Large, intelligent eyes focused on Tim's face, and the creature made a sound somewhere between a purr and a musical note. "Dragon," Tim breathed. "It's a baby dragon." The creature stepped closer, unafraid of the humans or their strange environment. It sniffed at Tim's helmet, then sat back on its haunches and began to clean the birthing fluid from its scales with a long, forked tongue. Hayes raised her scanner, but the dragon's scales suddenly turned red and it hissed at her. Not a threatening sound, but clearly a warning. It moved closer to Tim, pressing against his legs as if seeking protection. "It bonded with him," Hayes said in amazement. "Instant species recognition, despite completely different evolutionary paths. This should be impossible." The dragon's scales returned to their blue-silver color as it looked up at Tim. When Tim reached down to touch it, the creature allowed the contact, purring softly as small fingers stroked its neck. The sound of contentment echoed through the empty chamber, the first sign of life this ancient ship had known in countless years. Reynolds knew their simple salvage mission had just become something much more complicated. The dragon showed no interest in anyone except his son, and removing it by force seemed both cruel and potentially dangerous. Whatever they had found here would change everything they thought they knew about life in the galaxy. The dragon spread its tiny wings and chirped at Tim, a sound full of joy and recognition. 2 very different species, separated by millions of years of evolution, had found each other in the darkness of space. Neither would ever be the same. Water dripped from the broken recycling unit in Section C, marking time with its steady rhythm. Tim had counted over 3,000 drops since lunch, but he was not really paying attention to the sound. He was focused on the math problem floating on his tablet screen, numbers and symbols that would have been impossible for him to understand just 3 months ago. Spark lifted his head from where he had been napping on Tim's bed. The small dragon had grown considerably since hatching, now reaching Tim's waist when standing on his hind legs. His scales had settled into a deep emerald green with silver edges, and his wings had developed enough strength to carry him short distances around the ship's corridors. The bond between them had grown stronger as well. Tim could sense Spark's emotions as clearly as his own, and sometimes he caught glimpses of thoughts that did not belong to him. When Spark was curious about something, Tim felt that same curiosity burning in his chest. When the dragon was content, a warm feeling spread through Tim's mind like sunshine. "This equation does not make sense," Tim muttered, tapping his stylus against the screen. "The energy output should be much higher than what they are showing here." Spark patted over and looked at the tablet, his large eyes reflecting the glow of the screen. He made a soft chirping sound and touched his nose to a specific part of the equation. Suddenly, Tim understood. The formula was correct, but it was missing a variable that accounted for quantum fluctuations in the reactor core. "How did you know that?" Tim asked. But Spark had already lost interest and was investigating a loose cable behind the desk. Dr. Hayes found them there an hour later, working together on advanced fusion theory that should have been far beyond a young boy's comprehension. She had been studying their partnership for months, documenting every interaction and trying to understand the mechanism behind their bond. "Making progress on your studies?" Hayes asked, settling into the chair across from Tim. "The ship's power systems are more complicated than I thought," Tim replied without looking up from his tablet. "But Spark helps me understand the difficult parts." Hayes watched as the dragon climbed onto Tim's lap and peered at the screen again. There was definitely some form of information transfer happening between them, something that enhanced both their cognitive abilities. Tim's test scores had improved dramatically, while Spark demonstrated problem-solving skills far beyond what any Earth animal could achieve. "Tim, I need to ask you something important," Hayes said carefully. "Have you been having any strange dreams lately? Visions of places you have never seen?" Tim finally looked up from his work, his expression suddenly guarded. "Sometimes, but they are just dreams." Can you tell me about them? Tim glanced at Spark, who had gone very still in his lap. I see cities made of crystal and metal, floating in space around giant stars. There are others like Spark there, but much bigger, flying between the buildings with riders on their backs. It feels real, but it cannot be real because those places do not exist anymore. Hayes felt her pulse quicken. What happened to those cities in your dreams? Something came from the dark spaces between stars. Something that could not understand love or friendship or any good feelings. The dragons and their partners tried to fight it, but they were not warriors. So they hid their children in safe places and went to sleep, hoping someday the right people would find them. Spark chirped softly and nuzzled against Tim's chest. The boy scratched behind the dragon's ears, and Hayes could see the immediate relaxation that spread through both of them at the contact. An alarm echoed through the ship's corridors before Hayes could ask more questions. The emergency tone meant hostile contact, probably pirates looking for easy prey. The Harmony was a research vessel with minimal weapons, making it an attractive target for raiders who preferred victims that could not fight back. Stay here and keep quiet, Hayes told Tim as she headed for the door. Lock yourselves in and do not come out until someone you trust tells you it is safe. But as the airlock sealed behind her, something unexpected happened. Spark stood up on Tim's bed, his scales shifting to a deep red color that neither of them had seen before. The dragon's eyes began to glow with the same blue light they had seen in the egg chamber, and the air around him shimmered like heat rising from hot pavement. Tim felt the change in their bond immediately. Power flowed between them, ancient knowledge, awakening in both their minds. Spark was not just a companion or even a pet. He was a guardian, bred and trained by a civilization that had protected the galaxy for millions of years. The pirates breached the ship's hull in 3 places, expecting to find frightened scientists who would surrender without a fight. Instead, they found corridors filled with an oppressive sense of dread that made their hearts race and their hands shake. Some of them stopped advancing entirely, overcome by a terror they could not explain or resist. Their leader, a scarred woman named Vex, pushed through the fear and made it as far as the main corridor before she saw them. A human boy stood at the far end of the hallway, perfectly calm despite the chaos around him. Beside him was a creature she had never seen before, something with wings and scales and eyes that seemed to look directly into her soul. You should leave now, Tim said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite the distance between them. This ship is under our protection. Vex laughed and raised her weapon, but her finger would not squeeze the trigger. The dragon was doing something to her mind, filling it with images of failure and pain and death, not threats but visions of what would happen if she continued down this path. The fear spread to her crew through their helmet radios. Within minutes, the raiders were fleeing back to their own ship, abandoning their equipment and several wounded comrades in their haste to escape. Their vessel jumped away from the Harmony so quickly that its engines nearly overloaded. When the ship's security team reached Tim and Spark, they found the boy sitting on the floor with the dragon curled up in his lap. Both of them looked exhausted, as if they had just finished running a marathon. Are you hurt? Asked Chief Peterson, kneeling beside them. We are fine, Tim replied, but his voice sounded older somehow, weighted with knowledge that no 8-year-old should possess. They will not come back. They understand now that some things should not be disturbed. Spark opened one golden eye and chirped softly at Peterson, a sound that somehow conveyed both reassurance and warning. The dragon was still small enough to seem harmless, but everyone who looked at him now understood that his size had nothing to do with his actual power. Later, as the ship's crew worked to repair the damage from the attack, Hayes found herself watching Tim and Spark more carefully than ever. The bond between them was evolving into something unprecedented, something that might change humanity's place in the galaxy forever. But change, she reflected, was not always something to fear. Sometimes it was exactly what the universe had been waiting for. The shuttle bay doors opened with a mechanical hiss that seemed louder than usual in the artificial quiet of Earth Station Beta. Tim held Spark closer to his chest, feeling the dragon's scales shift from their usual green to a nervous yellow, as dozens of military personnel and scientists waited to greet them. Admiral Foster stepped forward, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. Behind him stood a collection of the most important people in human space: xenobiologists, military strategists, government officials, and representatives from colonies across 3 star systems. All of them wanted to study the unprecedented bond between a human child and an alien creature. "Welcome to Beta Station, Tim," Foster said in what was probably meant to be a friendly voice. "We have prepared excellent accommodations for both you and your companion. Our best scientists are eager to learn more about your unique relationship." Spark pressed closer to Tim's neck and made a low humming sound that vibrated through both their bodies. The dragon had never liked crowds, but this felt different. These people were not just curious. They were calculating, measuring, planning. Tim could sense their intentions through Spark's enhanced awareness, and none of those intentions felt particularly good. Dr. Hayes walked beside them as they were escorted through the station's corridors. She had argued against this recall for weeks, insisting that separating Tim and Spark from their familiar environment would be traumatic for both of them. But her objections had been overruled by people who cared more about potential military applications than the well-being of a child and his dragon. The quarters they were given were luxurious by station standards, with separate rooms for Tim and what the officials called the specimen. Tim refused to let Spark out of his sight, insisting that they stay together regardless of the inconvenience to their hosts. After an hour of increasingly tense negotiations, the adults gave up and allowed them to share the larger room. "Tomorrow we will begin a series of simple tests," explained Dr. Chen, the station's chief xenopsychologist. "Nothing invasive or harmful, just basic measurements to understand how your bond functions. We need to know if this connection could be replicated with other humans and other dragons." Tim did not answer, but Spark lifted his head and fixed Chen with a stare that made the scientist take an involuntary step backward. The dragon's eyes had developed an unsettling habit of seeming much older and wiser than his young body suggested. That night, Tim lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the station around them. Spark was curled up against his side, but the dragon's sleep was restless, filled with dreams that leaked into Tim's consciousness. Images of other young humans scattered across the galaxy, standing next to freshly hatched dragons that looked remarkably similar to Spark. "It is happening everywhere, is not it?" Tim whispered into the darkness. Spark opened his eyes and nodded, a gesture that still seemed strange coming from a creature that had never seen humans before meeting Tim. More eggs were hatching, always in the presence of human children, always creating the same instant bond that defied every known law of xenobiology. The tests began early the next morning. Dr. Chen and her team had prepared a series of exercises designed to measure the cognitive enhancement that Tim experienced when Spark was nearby. They started with simple puzzles and gradually moved to more complex problems involving mathematics, logic, and spatial reasoning. Tim scored well above genius level on every test, but only when Spark was in the same room. When they moved the dragon to an adjacent chamber separated by a thick wall, Tim's performance dropped to normal levels for a child his age. More concerning, both Tim and Spark showed signs of physical distress when kept apart for more than a few minutes. "The bond appears to be symbiotic rather than simply emotional," Chen noted, watching Tim's vital signs spike as Spark was moved to a containment area down the hall. Prolonged separation could be dangerous for both subjects, but Admiral Foster was more interested in the practical applications than the health risks. "If we can understand how this enhancement works, we could create a new generation of human dragon teams. Imagine what our explorers could accomplish with that kind of cognitive boost. And imagine what our military could do with dragons trained for warfare," added General Park, whose presence at the research station suggested that peaceful applications were not the only consideration. Tim's condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days, as the scientists insisted on longer periods of separation to test the limits of the bond. His temperature spiked, his coordination suffered, and he began experiencing severe headaches that made it difficult to think clearly. Spark fared even worse, his scales turning black and his usual cheerful chirping replaced by mournful wails that echoed through the station's corridors. Dr. Hayes protested the continued experiments, but her objections were dismissed by officials who seemed to view Tim and Spark as resources rather than living beings with their own rights and needs. The potential military and scientific benefits outweighed the welfare of two subjects, especially when one of those subjects was not even human. On the fourth day of forced separation, something unexpected happened. Other dragons began responding to Spark's distress calls, their voices carrying across interstellar distances through means that human science could not yet explain. On mining colonies, research stations, and exploration vessels throughout human space, crystalline eggs that had been dormant for millennia suddenly began to crack open. Each dragon that hatched immediately bonded with the nearest human child, creating an instant connection that was identical to the relationship between Tim and Spark. Within hours, reports were flooding in from across the galaxy of children demonstrating impossible abilities while strange creatures stayed loyally by their sides. The implications were staggering. This was not an isolated incident or a lucky accident. It was the activation of a network that had been waiting in dormancy for the right species to discover it. Humanity was not just finding alien technology. They were being invited to join something much larger and more ancient than they had ever imagined. Tim lay in the station's medical bay, too weak to sit up but still aware of everything happening around him through his connection to Spark. The dragon was being kept in a separate facility 3 levels away, but their bond had not weakened despite the physical distance and the scientists' best efforts to disrupt it. "We are linked to all of them now," Tim whispered to Dr. Hayes when she visited him. "Every child, every dragon, all connected like stars in a constellation. They are waking up because Spark called to them, and they called to each other." Hayes checked his vital signs and frowned at the readings. "Tim, you need to rest. Your body is fighting something it does not understand." "Not fighting," Tim corrected her, his voice barely audible. "Changing. We are all changing, becoming what we were meant to be. The dragons have been waiting so long for someone to understand them." Outside the medical bay, Admiral Foster and his team watched through the observation window as the boy who might hold the key to humanity's future struggled to survive their attempts to study him. The moral implications of their actions were becoming impossible to ignore, but the potential benefits seemed too valuable to abandon. The test had begun as a simple scientific inquiry, but it was rapidly becoming something much more complex. Humanity was being offered a chance to join an ancient alliance, but the price of that membership was still being calculated by people who saw everything in terms of strategic advantage. Tim closed his eyes and reached out through the network of connections that now spanned the galaxy, feeling the presence of dozens of other children who were experiencing the same transformation he was undergoing. They were no longer alone, any of them, and that knowledge gave him strength to endure whatever trials lay ahead. The dragons had chosen humanity for reasons that were only beginning to become clear, and Tim suspected that the real test was not how well humans could control or exploit this relationship, but whether they were worthy of the trust that had been placed in them. Sleep came differently now, pulling Tim into visions that felt more real than the sterile walls of his station quarters. He walked through cities that floated among the stars, their crystal spires reaching toward distant suns, while dragons larger than battleships soared between the towers. Their riders were not human, but they shared the same look of deep connection that Tim recognized in his own reflection. The Kethmari had built their civilization around partnership rather than conquest. Every major decision was made through the combined wisdom of bonded pairs, dragon and partner working together to solve problems that neither could handle alone. Their cities grew like living things, adapting to the needs of their inhabitants while maintaining perfect harmony with the cosmos around them. Tim experienced their golden age through Spark's genetic memories, seeing how the partnership had elevated both species beyond what either could achieve independently. The dragons provided intuitive understanding of energy and matter, while their partners contributed analytical thinking and creative problem-solving. Together they had created technologies that seemed like magic, worlds that bloomed with life, and a peace that had lasted for millions of years. But peace had made them vulnerable to something they could not understand or negotiate with. Spark stirred beside him on the narrow bed, his scales flickering between colors as he shared the same visions. The dragon's memories went deeper than Tim's, carrying echoes of terror and loss that belonged to ancestors who had faced the end of everything they held dear. The Void Seekers had emerged from the dark spaces between galaxies like a tide of living mathematics. They felt no emotions, formed no bonds, existed only to analyze and reduce everything they encountered to its most basic components. Where the Kethmari saw beauty in complexity and cooperation, the Seekers found only inefficiency that needed to be corrected. First contact had been a disaster. The Kethmari had tried every form of communication they knew, reaching out with empathy and understanding to beings who interpreted such gestures as attacks on their mental architecture. The Seekers could not be reasoned with because they genuinely could not comprehend the concept of cooperation between different species. The war that followed was less a conflict than a fundamental incompatibility. The Seekers dismantled Kethmari worlds with methodical precision, analyzing the technology and discarding the lives as irrelevant data. They could not be defeated through force because they adapted to every weapon, learned from every strategy, and felt no fear of death or failure. Tim watched through ancient eyes as the great dragon cities fell one by one. He felt the despair of beings who had never known hatred, learning to fight an enemy that could not be reached through any means they understood. The Kethmari were healers and teachers, not warriors, and their greatest strength became their greatest weakness against foes who saw compassion as a flaw to be eliminated. Dr. Hayes found him the next morning, sitting up in bed with tears streaming down his face while Spark pressed against his side and made low, mournful sounds. The dragon's scales had turned deep purple, a color she had never seen before, and both of them seemed aged by experiences far beyond their years. "The dreams again?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Not dreams. Memories. The dragons remember everything. Every world that was lost, every partner that died trying to protect others. Spark carries all of that inside him, and now I carry it too." Hayes checked her scanner readings, noting the unusual brain activity patterns that had become normal for Tim since the bonding. "Tell me about the enemy, these Void Seekers you mentioned." "Yesterday." Tim wiped his eyes and looked at her with an expression too serious for an 8-year-old face. "They are coming back. The dragons went into hiding when they realized they could not win, but they also sent out scout ships to find new partners. Stronger ones. The ship we found was not abandoned. It was a test to see if humans were ready." "Ready for what?" "To finish what the Kethmari started. To be the guardians that the galaxy needs." Tim's hand moved to rest on Spark's neck, and the dragon's scales shifted to a determined silver. "The Seekers have been waiting in the dark spaces, growing stronger, learning from every civilization they destroyed. But they never encountered humans before, and they do not understand what we bring to the partnership." Hayes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. "What do we bring that the Kethmari did not have?" "Stubbornness. The Kethmari were wise and peaceful, but when they realized they could not win, they gave up and went into hiding. Humans do not give up. We fight impossible odds because we are too stupid to know when we should quit. That stupidity, combined with dragon wisdom and power, might be enough to stop something that cannot be stopped." Spark raised his head and looked directly at Hayes, his golden eyes reflecting intelligence far beyond his apparent age. When he spoke, his voice resonated not through the air but directly in her mind, carrying concepts too complex for spoken language. The derelict ship had been one of thousands sent out during the final days of the Kethmari civilization. Each one carried eggs in stasis, waiting for the right species to awaken them. Most had found no one suitable and had continued drifting through space for eons. A few had encountered species with potential, but had been unable to form the necessary bonds. Only with humanity had the process worked perfectly, creating partnerships that were actually stronger than the originals. Hayes understood now why the military was so interested in studying these bonds. If the Void Seekers were really returning, humanity would need every advantage they could find. But the relationship between human and dragon could not be weaponized or mass-produced. It required genuine trust and affection, emotions that could not be faked or programmed. "How long do we have?" she asked. Tim closed his eyes and reached out through the network of bonded pairs that now spanned human space. Every child could sense what he sensed. Every dragon shared the same ancient fears and hopes. The connections were growing stronger, each day, creating a web of awareness that stretched across light years. They already know we are here. The first bonds were like lighting a beacon in the darkness, telling everyone in the galaxy that the Guardians have returned. The Seekers will come to finish what they started. But this time they will find opponents who will not surrender. Spark chirped softly and projected a series of images into both their minds. Human children standing beside dragons of every size and color. Their partnerships creating a network of protection around colonies and research stations. Not an army in the traditional sense, but something more flexible and adaptable than conventional military forces. The Kethmari had failed because they fought like Kethmari, using their own strengths and strategies against an enemy that could not be understood through their cultural framework. Humans would fight like humans with creativity and desperation, and a complete disregard for the odds against them. "We need to prepare," Tim said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed strange coming from such a young person. "The Seekers are methodical, but they are also predictable. They will come in force expecting to find the same peaceful civilization they destroyed before. Instead, they will find something they have never encountered. Guardians who learned from the past but are not bound by it." Hayes looked at the boy and his dragon, seeing in them the seeds of something that could change the course of galactic history. The partnership was still new and fragile, but it carried within it the accumulated wisdom of an ancient civilization and the indomitable spirit of humanity. The test was over. The real challenge was about to begin, and this time the Guardians would not run or hide when faced with the impossible. They would stand and fight because that was what humans did when everything they cared about was threatened. Spark spread his wings and sang a note of pure determination that echoed through the station's corridors, calling to his distant cousins and their human partners. The network heard and responded, a chorus of voices across the stars declaring that the age of hiding was over. The galaxy would have its protectors again, and this time, they would not fail. The first warning came from the Deep Space Monitoring Station at the edge of human territory. Ships were emerging from the void between galaxies, their forms so alien that the sensors struggled to classify them as vessels rather than geometric anomalies. They moved with perfect mathematical precision, traveling in formations that hurt to look at directly. Tim felt their approach through every nerve in his body. The network of bonded pairs across human space reacted like a single organism, children and dragons from dozens of worlds sharing the same moment of terror and recognition. The Void Seekers had returned, and they brought with them the accumulated knowledge of every civilization they had destroyed over millions of years. Admiral Foster gathered his fleet at Luna Station, every available warship positioning itself between Earth and the approaching enemy. Humanity had never faced a threat on this scale, but they had learned enough from the Kethmari memories to understand what was coming. This would not be a conventional war with battles and territories, but a fundamental conflict between two incompatible ways of existence. Spark had grown again during the weeks of preparation, now large enough for Tim to ride on his back during their practice flights around the station. The dragon's abilities had expanded as well, allowing him to phase through solid matter, generate electromagnetic pulses, and project his consciousness across vast distances to coordinate with other bonded pairs. "They are not like us," Tim explained, to the gathered military commanders, his young voice carrying the authority of ancient experience. "They do not think like us, do not value what we value, cannot understand why we fight for each other instead of just for ourselves. That difference is both our weakness and our strength." General Park studied the tactical displays showing the enemy formation. "Our weapons had no effect on Kethmari technology, and the Seekers have had millions of years to improve their defenses. What makes you think we can succeed where your predecessors failed?" Tim exchanged a look with Spark, and the dragon's scales shifted to a confident gold. "Because the Kethmari fought the way they lived, with patience and wisdom and careful planning. Humans fight the way we live, with stubbornness and creativity and complete disregard for impossible odds. The Seekers have adapted to counter-wisdom, but they have never encountered stupidity backed by determination." The enemy fleet reached the outer edge of the solar system 3 days later. Their ships defied easy description, appearing as crystalline, Structures that folded space around themselves while projecting fields of absolute emptiness that absorbed light and heat and hope itself. They moved through human defenses like they were not there, phasing past weapons fire and energy barriers as if such things were merely inconvenient suggestions. The first battle at Mars Station lasted exactly 17 minutes. Human vessels fired everything they had, their weapons passing harmlessly through enemy ships that existed in too many dimensions to be damaged by conventional means. The Seekers responded with precision strikes that disabled rather than destroyed, leaving the crews alive but helpless as their technology was analyzed and catalogued. But the Seekers had not accounted for the Dragon Bonds. As their ships approached Earth, they encountered something unprecedented in their long history of conquest. The network of paired consciousness surrounding the planet created a field of emotional resonance that their mental architecture could not process. They had adapted to counter weapons and shields and strategic thinking, but they had no defense against the simple concept of love. Tim rode Spark through the battle zone above Earth's atmosphere, their bond allowing them to coordinate with dozens of other pairs scattered throughout the solar system. Each human dragon team became a node in a defensive network that confused and disoriented the attackers by broadcasting emotions they could not understand or filter out. The Seekers tried to adapt, analyzing the empathic field and searching for ways to counter it. But emotion was not technology that could be reverse engineered or mathematics that could be solved. It was the fundamental essence of life itself, and the Void Seekers had long ago purged such inefficiencies from their own existence. "Now," Tim whispered, and every bonded pair in human space heard him through their connection. The Dragon Network activated in perfect synchronization, their combined consciousness focusing on a single purpose: not to destroy the enemy, because the Seekers could adapt to any attack, but to show them something they had never seen before: the beauty of imperfection, the strength found in vulnerability, the power that came from choosing to protect others, even when it meant sacrificing yourself. The effect was devastating. Seeker ships began to falter as their crews experienced sensations they had no framework for understanding. Fear and love and hope flooded through their neural networks, causing cascading failures in systems designed for pure logical efficiency. Some vessels simply stopped moving, their occupants overwhelmed by the sudden awareness of everything they had lost when they chose perfect logic over messy, inefficient life. But the largest Seeker command ship adapted faster than the others. Its central intelligence began filtering the emotional bombardment, isolating itself from the network effects that had crippled its fleet. It focused its attention on the source of the disruption, identifying Tim and Spark as the primary nodes. In the defensive matrix, the ship's weapons locked onto their position with mathematical precision. Energy beams that could slice through planets converged on the small dragon and his human partner as they flew through the debris field of disabled vessels. There was nowhere to run, no way to dodge, and no defense that could stop an attack designed to eliminate entire star systems. Tim felt the targeting systems focus on them and knew they had seconds to live. Through the network, he sensed the other bonded pairs preparing to take their place as coordinators, ready to continue the fight even after he and Spark were gone. The knowledge should have been comforting, but all he could think about was how much he would miss his dragon's presence in his mind. "I am sorry," he whispered to Spark. "I should have been smarter, should have found a better way." Spark's response came not in words but in pure emotion, flooding Tim's consciousness with love and gratitude and absolute acceptance. The dragon had never expected to survive this battle, had known from the moment he hatched that his purpose was to help humanity become what they needed to be. If his life ended here, protecting the boy who had freed him from an eternity of sleep, then it was a good death. But Tim was not ready to accept that ending. The stubbornness that had driven humanity to the stars, the refusal to surrender that had built their civilization in defiance of a hostile universe, rose up in his chest like fire. He would not let his partner die, would not let the Seekers win, would not let the galaxy fall to creatures who had forgotten how to care about anything beyond their own cold perfection. The targeting beams reached their position just as Tim made his choice. Instead of trying to escape or defend against the attack, he opened his bond with Spark completely, tearing down every barrier between their minds and souls. The feedback was agonizing, like touching a live wire with his bare thoughts. But he held on as their consciousness merged into something entirely new. The transformation rippled through the entire network. Every human-dragon pair felt the change, as their own bonds deepened beyond anything the Kethamari had ever achieved. They were no longer separate beings working together, but unified entities that combined the best qualities of both species while transcending the limitations of either. Tim Spark rose from the wreckage of their individual selves, no longer a boy and his dragon, but something unprecedented in the history of the galaxy. They moved through space without a ship, their merged consciousness manipulating matter and energy through will alone. The seeker weapons passed harmlessly through them, unable to target something that existed in dimensions beyond physical reality. The command ship's intelligence tried to analyze this new threat, but found nothing in its vast database of conquered civilizations that matched what it was observing. This was not an evolution of Kethamari technology or an advancement of human engineering. It was something entirely original, born from the unique combination of human determination and dragon wisdom. Other bonded pairs throughout the solar system began undergoing the same transformation, their individual identities merging into collective entities that were stronger than the sum of their parts. The network became a web of unified consciousness, spanning light years, each node capable of independent action while remaining connected to the greater whole. The Seekers found themselves facing an enemy they could not understand, analyze, or adapt to counter. Their weapons were useless against beings who existed partially outside normal space-time. Their logic could not process creatures who chose to sacrifice individual existence for collective strength. Their accumulated knowledge meant nothing against opponents who were writing entirely new rules for what life could become. One by one, the Seeker ships began to withdraw, not because they were damaged or defeated in any conventional sense, but because they had encountered something that fundamentally challenged their basic assumptions about existence. They needed time to process, to analyze, to find ways to counter this unprecedented development. But as they retreated toward the edge of the solar system, something unexpected happened. The unified consciousness of Tim Spark reached out to them, not with weapons or threats, but with an offer of understanding. Through the network, they projected images of what the Seekers had once been before they purged emotion from their existence, curious explorers who had started down the path of pure logic as a way to better understand the universe. For the first time in millions of years, some of the Seekers hesitated. Deep in their neural matrices, buried under eons of cold calculation, fragments of their original selves stirred at the touch of genuine compassion. They remembered wonder, remembered the joy of discovery, remembered what it felt like to care about something beyond mere efficiency. The command ship's intelligence struggled with contradictory impulses as it processed this unexpected data. Logic demanded that it eliminate these dangerous anomalies and continue with the mission of bringing order to chaos. But something deeper, something it had thought long dead, whispered that perhaps there was value in the very chaos it sought to destroy. The Seeker fleet vanished into the void between galaxies, but their departure felt different from a retreat. They were not fleeing in defeat, but withdrawing to reconsider everything they thought they knew about existence. The seeds of doubt that the network had planted might grow into something that could change them, as fundamentally as the bonding had changed humanity. Tim Spark floated in the debris field above Earth, feeling the presence of dozens of other, unified beings who had once been separate children and dragons. They were still individuals in some ways, still capable of independent thought and action, but they were also part of something larger that spanned the galaxy and might someday reach beyond it. Dr. Hayes watched from the observation deck of Luna, station as the transformed guardians gathered around Earth like living constellations. She could no longer distinguish which lights were Tim and Spark, but she could feel their presence in her mind, warm and reassuring and utterly alien from what they had been just hours before. Humanity had passed the test, but in doing so they had become something new. The galaxy would have its protectors again, beings capable of understanding both the value of order and the necessity of chaos. They would guard against threats like the Seekers while also reaching out to lost civilizations that had forgotten how to feel. The age of hiding was over, and the age of healing had begun. Across the stars, other species would learn that the Guardians had returned, not as conquerors or judges, but as friends who understood that the universe was large enough for every form of consciousness that chose love over fear. In the depths of space, more crystalline eggs began to pulse with blue light, waiting for the next species ready to join the growing network of understanding. The dragons had found their partners, and together they would ensure that no world would ever again face the darkness alone.